What's up you guys, I'm Dan, this is Frugal Not Cheap. In today's video we'll look at 6 different risks in early retirement and ways that I see in order to mitigate them. So to set the stage, I'm coming at this from the perspective of financial independence, retire early, or FIRE. So we're talking a much earlier retirement than conventionally, not really just like in your late 50s or something like that compared to 65. I'm talking more about in your 30s or 40s, that kind of thing. Now that doesn't mean that these risks don't apply necessarily to the older years as well, but just to let you know kind of where my head is at. If you're new to the concept of FIRE and you're wondering how someone might retire in their 30s or 40s, the basic idea is that if you can build a portfolio, an investment portfolio that's 25 times as big as your annual expenses, then that should be able to fund an early retirement. And this comes from some math that basically sets what is the safe withdrawal rate. In other words, how much can I withdraw from my portfolio on an annual and inflation-adjusted basis and still have my portfolio survive through my early retirement. I think the initial study period was like 30 years. And then, of course, we can be more conservative in trying to increase the chances that this thing is going to work beyond 30 years when we talk about those really early retirement ages. Now, of course, nothing's guaranteed and there are a lot of risks. In fact, we're going to look at a lot of the risks today. But the basic math works out to 25 times your annual expenses because that safe withdrawal rate is often looked at as 4%. And if you take 100 divided by 0.04, which is 4%, then you get 25. That's the 25x. If you want to learn a little bit more about the topic, I do have, I think, a fun video about how I discovered this idea of FIRE. In it, I also point out some good resources or ones that helped me along the way. One of the key ideas is that because the amount that you need to save, have in your portfolio, is dependent on what your annual expenses are, or actually to be more specific, it's the ratio between how much you earn and how much you spend. The wider that gap is, the better. You can get to FIRE much quicker. If you have a very high savings rate of like 50% or more, you might be able to do it in 15 years or even less, maybe even 10 years. Now, personally, I am living in Bangkok, Thailand, but I'm still working part-time for my employer back in the States. Still, the risks that I'll cover in today's video are some that I've thought about for the future when I do fully FIRE. The first risk is sequence of returns risk. This is basically having the really poor luck that in the years immediately following one's early retirement, that the market performs very poorly, either having no or negative returns. This could seriously impact the survivability chances of the portfolio over the long run, especially if, say, the market were to fall, I don't know, 30-40% and somehow stay there, not recover very quickly. Then every year we'd be withdrawing from a much smaller portfolio, and this could make the chances of the early retirement working out much lower. There are a number of ways that I could think about to address these, but personally I've used basically 2 strategies. One is that I plan to have a withdrawal rate that's significantly lower than 4%. That does mean that one ends up oversaving in order to achieve that lower withdrawal rate, but it also mitigates a lot of the risk, and so that's a trade-off, that has to be considered. Second, the investment portfolio is not the only source of income. Thanks to you guys, this channel does provide a little bit of spending money, so that's kind of nice, very much appreciated. And finally, I have a cash or cash alternatives buffer. Really, it's not that much cash. It's mostly invested in SGOV, that short-term treasuries ETF. So, this is basically like, I don't know, having a high yield savings account, for instance, this kind of thing. So I've got a buffer of between 6 and 12 months in order to be able to weather those storms. But there's a lot of downsides to that too. I mean, one is you don't know when the bottom of the market is going to be. No one's got a crystal ball. You don't know when it's going to start rebounding, right? Second, this does put a drag on the portfolio. So if we've got more than 12 months in cash, like maybe 2 years or something like that, then that's going to be not performing anywhere near as well as the rest of the portfolio that's invested in riskier assets, at least over the long run, right? So it does present a drag on the portfolio. But I think having the 6 to 12 months, basically like an emergency fund or just some cash, this does allow a bit more flexibility. So I don't necessarily have to sell any stock at a time time when the market has just seen a very, very sharp downturn. If it were to fall like 50% or something, then I could use this in order to weather the storm until it starts to recover to some degree. The second risk that we'll talk about here is medical costs. As Americans are acutely aware, medical expenses can be very, very devastating. According to a 2019 NIH study, so their idea was to see, have things gotten any better after the Affordable Care Act? They found that nearly 60% of bankruptcy filers in their, study sample had pointed to medical costs as a contributing factor. 40% of respondents pointed to illness-related, kind of like work disruptions or loss, and over 65% cited at least one of the two. So it was a very, very large factor behind bankruptcies in the United States. Now, of course, being adequately insured is an obvious way to mitigate this risk of a medical bankruptcy. However, there's still a lot to think about unless our budget is unlimited. What kinds of coverage do I need? Do I need both inpatient and outpatient? Do I need prescription drug coverage? Do I need dental? What countries or regions do I need coverage in? I did put together a video about, my personal journey in finding health insurance to live here in Thailand, so you can check that out here if you'd like. But now let's talk about the third risk, which is high inflation. So of course, a rapid and sustained increase in the cost of living could definitely hurt the survivability chances for my portfolio in early retirement. This is especially the case if the inflation rate in the country I'm living or spending in is uncorrelated with the performance of the asset base that I have. In other words, let's say that I have all US stocks, which I don't, but if I did, and I was living in, Zimbabwe, the inflation in the US stocks, which would be built into the performance over time, would not be keeping up with the inflation in Zimbabwe, for instance. Now, of course, there are ways to mitigate the risk of inflation. In the short run, we can adjust our spending habits, either cut back or look at categories that are not rising as quickly, because inflation isn't really across the board, right? There tends to be items which see more inflation than others. So definitely something to consider in order to mitigate those risks in the short run. In the longer run, though, it could be good to be flexible in terms of where I live. I mean, if I did end up in kind of a Zimbabwe situation, that might not be the best place to stick around in. And certainly I'd be in big, big trouble if all my assets were denominated in the currency of that country. So it's probably a good idea to have kind of some international diversity and mitigate that currency risk as well. But having that flexibility to move to different places could be difficult if I've made some decisions such as buying property or land. This could make things a little bit stickier. But of course I could try to rent it out or try to sell it, and hopefully the market wouldn't be terrible at that time. As with many risks, it's probably more important to do proper groundwork ahead of time. So one idea would be to choose a country that tends to have a relatively stable, system and also a lower rate of inflation historically. According to the World Bank, inflation here in Thailand has averaged about 4% since 1960. That's a little bit higher, 4.05%, a little bit higher than the 3.76% average for the United States over the same period, but not completely out of line. But more importantly, in recent times, so looking at the 10-year moving average since around 2018, Thailand's rate of inflation has actually been lower than the United States on a 10-year moving average basis. Okay, the fourth risk to early retirement in today's video is divorce. I'm unmarried, so that's not an issue right now, but it is, a potential issue in the future. So of course, having your asset base cut in half and then potentially having alimony or child support and other financial obligations, that's going to be very, very difficult for one's early retirement. In order to mitigate that risk, there is the possibility of doing a prenuptial and maybe also a postnuptial agreement of some kind to have some kind of protection there. But that's also not very romantic, I guess. And but yeah, anyway, so that'd be a personal choice. But I think a very important one is also, again, doing kind of like laying the groundwork. So in other words, choosing a spouse wisely. So there are a lot, there's no certainty in life, but there are a lot of factors that do contribute to a lower divorce rate. There are correlations between socioeconomic factors, so basically income, and also educational attainment. There are some cultural differences as well involved in that. So if we look at data from divorce.com and you were trying to find kind of like the lowest risk sort of cohort or grouping, you'd be looking at highly educated, affluent Asian women in states such as Massachusetts, Illinois, Texas. Those would give you kind of the lowest divorce rates, amongst the sample of data that they have. But it is hopeful to point out that the divorce rate has been actually falling since around 2011. Another interesting thing that we see in the data is it's about 69% of divorces that are initiated by the women in the relationship. Risk number 5 is a little bit different. This isn't really so much of like a risk to the early retirement per se, but a risk that's engendered by the early retirement, and that is the difficulty in re-entering the workforce. So let's say that one had a very early retirement, 25, 30, 35, something like that, out of work for about 10 years. Then the divorce happens. The first marriage does tend to break down when it does. I think the average longevity is like 8 years or something like that. So around that time. So now we've been out of work for a while. It could be very difficult to re-enter the workforce, but we might need to if we had again an expensive divorce or runaway inflation or some major medical costs, what have you. We might have to go back to work. And on the plus side, we are still relatively young, so that part does go in our favor. However, we also have this big gap in resume, and our skills may also not be up to date anymore, certainly especially in the field that we might have been in beforehand. One way that I've mitigated this risk personally is by having this YouTube channel. Now, as you know, this is very much a hobby for me, and I have not put really any effort whatsoever into trying to monetize it. I've been contacted by a lot of companies about their products and doing kind of different things. But it's just not something I'm interested in. I want to be able to tell you guys exactly what I believe, and then only talk about, only recommend products that I know and love and use. And so I've got some referral links in the description, but that's really the extent of all that, right? There are no sponsorships. However, if I ever really needed to, there are some ways that I could monetize the channel without, completely selling out. One idea that I've had is that I've done a lot of personal finance consulting, and so, if push came to shove and I needed to earn some extra income, then I could always put the word out that, hey, I'm taking on clients. If you want a finance coach, that I'd be able to help you with that. But that's not something that I'm offering at the moment. Or to be more clear, to friends and family, I do that pro bono just because I like to help people, but it's not something that I'm offering for the public at large. The other thing to consider is that it's not like the portfolio is going to go to completely zero, right? So there is still going to be the ability to draw some income from it. It's just going to be much reduced in these kind of scenarios that we're talking about, these sort of devastating cases. But what that means, though, is that we don't need to replace the entire income necessarily. And so it might not be that hard. I don't need to go back to being, head trader at a commodity trading firm. I could find some other job in order to replace the income that's necessary. And so, hopefully that would be easier. And especially considering that I'm living here in Thailand, it might not be too hard to find a job online that's going to be able to fund, a good portion of my expenses here. Okay, and finally, our sixth risk is really I'd group it as sort of lifestyle risks. And there's sort of two categories that I'm thinking about here. One is boredom, and then the other is a lack of purpose. But essentially, I'm talking about a dissatisfaction with the early retirement lifestyle. And this is actually a very, very important one. I think there can be a tendency amongst people that are in the FIRE community to be looking to escape from something. In other words, escaping from their stressful job and having this vague notion of financial freedom and the ability to do whatever. So they think a lot about what they're escaping from, but maybe not enough thought has been put into what they're escaping to. And really a lot of this, again, can be mitigated by groundwork. In other words, that, while still working full-time, I was still invested and involved in the things that give me purpose, keep me entertained, and give my life joy, basically, while I was still working. And it's just a matter of expanding and continuing those things in early retirement. So personally, of course, this YouTube channel brings a lot of purpose. I try to put out content that's going to help people out there, make up your own minds, like do your own research and all those caveats. But I'm hopeful that the information is helpful for people. And of course, this does take effort and dedication and discipline. And I think those kinds of things are really necessary for happiness. Humans are not built, I don't think, to be happy just lollygagging around. We need some kind of struggle, some goals, in order to have a sense of purpose. We also need, of course, others. So spending time with friends and family, that's a big one. So it wouldn't be good if I were working towards FIRE and really isolated from everybody, that's not going to be good. And then another way to get meaning, at least for me, has been to live a life of service. So when I'm offline and I'm not on camera here editing videos and stuff, I am spending time with friends and family, but I find other ways as well to be of service to my fellow man, and I find that to be incredibly rewarding and really gives my life a lot of meaning. So there you have it. Those are 6 risks that I see in early retirement and how I've thought about mitigating them. Did I miss any? Are there other mitigating factors or strategies that you can think of? Let us know in the comments. Hope you enjoyed today's video and found it helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.